A bit about DG. DG is a Choctaw contemporary artist, a Choctaw Code Talkers Association board member. His work has been featured at the Epcot Center, at Disney World, at the Grand Palais in France, at the National Museum of the American Indian in Washington, D.C., in addition to other places. He's been commissioned to paint several portraits, including U.S. Justice Sandra Day O'Connor, U.S. Congressman Senator Tom Cole, and T. Boone Pickens, and not to be totally stateside, he also, I believe, was commissioned to do a portrait of Sir Tony Blair. So much experience in this man, much wisdom. He is a friend of the center. On multiple occasions, he has chosen to drive to Stillwater and share his insight and input, and we're all better for it. So thank you so much, and without further ado, thank you.
All right. So this is an interesting topic. You know, in the course of the emails leading up to this, there was one expression that kind of came out that was written and said, expression of art through sovereignty. And although it's not directly the same thing as the title of today, Sovereignty Through Art, hopefully later on we can come back to that expression because that's a very fascinating construct that kind of came up. It's also interesting to be in a university setting because it means that I get to use certain words that otherwise I don't get to use. And with that, I wanted to start with demarking the difference between art within a collective environment, which is a tribal construct, because it is so different than from an individual's perspective or an individual society, which is the dominant society's form, which we're all citizens of, and be a dual citizen. When we choose to do things like this, they are in direct contrast. They're not necessarily contrarian, but they are in direct contrast. And I think it's important to understand that sovereignty through art is pivoted on the idea of a group identity being positive. And it reflects something that's cardinal to the construct of self-determination, the group's ability to determine what constitutes self. This is fundamentally different than an individual approach to expressing what's going on in their life. When you are an artist and you are representing a nation, either officially or unofficially just by being a citizen in this context, good, bad, and different, your work is perceived as being the position of a nation. So that's one point that we can talk to about later on. And we have to understand, too, that there's another aspect that art plays into this when you have this construct of, a group defining what constitutes self. Art facilitates in these very abstract processes. I mean, it's axiomatic that it helps get around these large constructs, which in an academic setting we can speak to with great specificity, but when we're dealing with a lot of our families who are not well educated, art helps that transition, helps bridge those spaces. So I would want to talk today with a little bit more specificity about the context of my tribal heritage in terms of where my historical background connects to this. And this is one of those rare occasions where normally I say I can only speak to my nation, but being that we have both Choctaws and Chicashas in this house, I can speak to both spaces because ours don't have this cultural delineation. So, and I can speak broader to the Southeastern Indian tradition of art. So I'm going to begin with just one paragraph from a book by Dr. Susan Power from Marshall University, specifically on the pre-contact role of the artist in the Southeastern society. And so it begins like this: thus, the integral role of the art in social, political, and religious endeavors not only defined art's purpose, but also generated support for the considerable effort and resources devoted to it. The ultimate purpose of Mississippian art was to express the Southeastern Indians' worldview and their desire to maintain harmony, balance, and purity in constant struggle among the world's realms, the upper world, this world, and the underworld. Art was allegorical and metaphorical, with a diversity of expression ranging from the humorous to the brutal. Conventional representation, used extensively, was formed by agreement, sanctioned by the group. Obviously, Many people were involved in the creation, circulation, and use of art, but without power and without question, the artists and the chieftain leaders were central to its definition. Now, having said that, one of the fundamental shifts that we're seeing in Oklahoma art right now, and I'd speak to Oklahoma, is this delineation between the native artist and the non-native artist. We follow two entirely different tracks of career. We follow two different tracks of conversation. We follow two different tracks of the actual imagery. Rarely do they intersect. When we intersect, we get excited, but we're not at a point where they're going to blend. And they're not going to blend for a long time, because actually we're experiencing something so radical, something so beautiful, something so momentous that, I'm sorry, they don't have the wellspring right now that we're tapping into, when people are really tapping into something fundamentally human and as an aggregate as a people. I mean, this is a great example. The fact that this is even here, and in one lifetime to go from the institutional prejudice that existed to an institution which celebrates it, this is a tremendous amount of aggregate power. And if the artist is not reflecting this, the artist is not doing their job. We have a wonderful place as collective artists, and by that I mean the collective's artist, because we can tap into these places where an artist otherwise is constantly being demarked by isolation. Ours isn't isolated. Ours is celebrated by aggregates. Ours is being celebrated immediately. It's fascinating that the artist within Indian country is viewed as a high profession. It's not viewed as something bohemian. It's viewed as something on the kin of being a banker, a surgeon, a judge. And so you're afforded a greater responsibility, or I should say afforded greater respect, but that comes with greater responsibility, because you're not speaking for yourself. What the artists, on another point, what we're experiencing right now is, and we're going to see this more and more, is the differentiation between tribal citizen and cultural understanding as a citizen. So that by virtue of me being Choctaw, anything I produce as a Choctaw citizen is Choctaw. Does that mean that it's Choctaw? No, it does not mean it's Choctaw. I see, and I'll give an illustration of that, what that means. I was a judge at one of our competitions a few years ago, and one of our citizens submitted a painting, and it was a painting that had an owl as the main feature. Well, the problem is that it was a good painting, but it revealed they had no construct of what their families who are traditionalists would understand by this thing. So the painting subject itself revealed their lack of understanding. It revealed that they were truly Choctaw, but I had to get the piece off the property because that is what the traditionalists, this is important to them. And so this is an interesting aspect. The collective artist has to consider the mores and the norms of the group, which means that, as my grandfather always said, you know, you can't espouse the traditional and not submit to it. And so in this context, it's a very big difference between an individualist artist or an artist coming from a society that's individualist and one that's collective. We have to submit to these rules and norms. It's a part of the parcel. It's frustrating sometimes, but you knew what you were getting into. I want to speak too to this idea and how are we doing on time? 5 more minutes? Okay, good. I want to speak too to this one point right here where it says, obviously, many people were involved in the creation, circulation, use of art, but without question, the artists and chieftain leaders were central to its definition. Because of that role that is afforded an artist within Indian country, and specifically amongst the Choctaws or the Chickasaws and the southeastern ones, that we're going to see more and more redefinition of those roles from the leadership of our particular our nations, that we become not necessarily propagandists of, not necessarily mouthpieces of, but that we are definitely reflecting where the nation is at that moment. This is important because we are sitting in such a time glut. And by that I mean, for the past 200-300 years between our nations, there has been a dire need of substantial art. But you have these priorities. You have to survive, then you have to build up, you have to be able to spread that around the collective so that everybody are being taken care of, so that then you can move on. Then you can begin to create the art that reflects the past, where we are and where we're going. And thankfully, we're beginning to see that. And it's happened in such a fast amount of time when you really consider the past 40 years. The next 40 years are going to produce the best artwork Oklahoma's in this region's ever seen. Why? Because with the resources, the strength, the power politics that are involved to get our position placed in front of the dominant society, placed in front of people again, which finally our nations can bring to bear and hold people accountable on, the artwork that voices out from this society is going to show our perspective. But it's going to show our perspective where we are now, and that is strong. That is strong. And so the artwork is going to become a reflection of where we are. It's just like what happened this past year. I had the privilege and honor of being the design lead on an art project in Choctaw Nation, which constitutes, not because it's great art, even though I think it's great art, but because of this big void being the art collection of its age. I mean, being able to create pieces that are in large format of, pieces that reflect Tuscaloosa at the Battle Mobile, being able to reflect people, at 15 by 5 scales, 9 by 5 scales, scales worthy of what should be a nation's artwork. A nation should have good artwork because that is ultimately how you and I, after all these years of being persecuted, we rely upon the oral tradition, which is an art form, having been couched within the aggressor's Christian missiology, not Christian, but the missiology, the Christianization process. To put our language in there is an art form. We then look back in our archaeology to help build up and fill in those gaps. What are we relying on? We're relying on art as a gauge of who we are. Now, as we celebrate to the future, as we have our elders, we still have some very, very old elders. In our traditions, we tell them what's gone on so that when they move on, they can bear witness. And they get to bear witness for the first time in 500 years, something good, something magnificent. And so the art sears into their mind an image that they share when they go on. This is power. This is what it is to look back and realize that sovereignty through art is not a privilege. It is a responsibility. It is a fundamental tenet of who we are. We express who we are, yes, through our businesses. But we express who we are through the arts so that those in the future can sit back, be forced to sit down, and be forced to reflect on what's changed. Thank you.